So our keynote speaker is a personal friend and has been a mentor for me since I was in internship residency and pulmonary critical care fellowship, and really the reason I ended up staying at Vanderbilt. He is an amazing leader in pulmonary medicine and clinical trials, and our Vice Chancellor for Clinical Research at Vanderbilt. Please help me welcome Dr. Gordon Bernard, who will be speaking to us regarding rethinking clinical trials in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Gordon, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and talk to you about a topic that is not directly related to interstitial lung disease, but is a potential platform upon which we can build a lot more knowledge about the management of any disease much faster. What I'll be talking about today is an attempt to merge the research programs at major academic medical centers with the operations of those medical centers. This will become more obvious as I give you some examples in a few minutes. But right now, when you conduct a clinical trial, it's said to take as long as 17 years to take the results from the trial to practice. And that's partly in our hands as doctors. It also takes a long time for that kind of information to weave its way into the operations of a major medical center, meaning the staff and nurses and others that take care of patients. So our goal here is to try to merge these or cause these to overlap and have exchange of information much more efficiently. So we're looking at building a platform here that creates a reusable fixed infrastructure. I don't know if I... Yeah, here. So create a reusable fixed infrastructure that can have study-specific tailoring and allow interventions to be tested in a rapid-fire fashion. And at the time we get results, we publish those results always, whether they're positive or negative, but we can de-implement things that aren't working, and we can implement things that should be in our everyday operations. And I'll give you examples, and that'll make this much more clear. We are combining this work with a Clinical and Translational Science Award. This is an NIH award that is the biggest grant that Vanderbilt has for our clinical research. And it's from the NIH. It's the money that you just voted for with your text messages. So I hope you like what you see and that you agree that this is a good way to spend money. But what we want to do is promote the discovery of routine in the routine course of healthcare delivery, encourage innovation from all clinical areas, support and develop research endeavors that answer world questions, enhance quality and safety, and enhance charge implementation. So one of the fundamentals to moving research very efficiently is the actual screening and enrollment of patients into a clinical study. As you all know, the standard randomized clinical trial that's testing a new drug involves a pretty lengthy consent process and a lot of information and education about the matter. The federal regulations and ethical considerations say there are times when we can waive that process. And you can do this when the interventions that you're looking at are considered to be minimal risk, the waiver does not adversely affect the rights and welfare of the participants, consent is impracticable, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and when appropriate, all participants would be provided with additional pertinent information after they participated in the project. Most of these are pretty clear-cut one way or the other. The impracticable is the tricky one. Some institutional review boards look at impracticable and they say, if you had enough money and enough people and enough time, could you answer this clinical question with going through a standard consent process? And if the answer is yes, then you have to have a standard consent process. But that's a pretty tall bar to reach. So now most IRBs are looking at this as, if it's going to take millions and millions of dollars and many years to conduct this project, but it could be shortened dramatically by going through this process, then does that mean it's impracticable and therefore meet these criteria? And so I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, and you can decide for yourself whether you would have declared these impracticable or not. So the first one I'm going to show you is a story about chlorhexidine bathing in intensive care. One of the huge problems we have in intensive care is infections. Infections that weren't there when the patient got to the ICU, but develop while they're there. And there are studies, not good ones, that suggest that if we bathe the patients in chlorhexidine, a potent antibacterial skin cleanser, that this will reduce infection rates. Kind of logical, you would imagine that would likely be true. However, the data weren't very strong. So we conducted a randomized study. We call it a cluster randomized multiple crossover design trial. This is the 5 intensive care units at Vanderbilt Hospital. They were randomized to use exclusively chlorhexidine on a given month, and on another given month, exclusively soap to bathe patients. And this was randomly assigned by month over a year's time. And the study was conducted from July of 2012 to July of 2013, and all patients admitted to the participating 5 ICUs were included, and there were some potential exclusions, although none of these actually happened in the course of the study. And this one was done with waiver of informed consent, as I mentioned before. So all patients were bathed either with chlorhexidine impregnated sponges or soap impregnated sponges. All other infection control procedures were performed as we normally do. The composite primary outcome was healthcare associated infections. Those abbreviations are central line associated bloodstream infections, catheter associated urinary tract infections, Clostridium difficile infection, colon infection, and ventilator associated pneumonia. All of the data were collected from the medical record of our hospital, and all of the infection-related outcomes were adjudicated by the Infection Control Service, which does this all the time anyway as part of our standard procedures. And this just shows the 4 units. There's, 5 units, sorry, cardiovascular, medical, neurosurgical, and trauma. And you can see the randomization schedule here, control, chlorhexidine, and ultimately there were over 9,000 patients randomized to one or the other bathing approaches. So, sorry, I had an animation here, I forgot. And so at the end of the day, there were over 4,000 patients in the chlorhexidine group and over 4,000 patients in the control group. In IPF studies, I bet there's never been an IPF study this size. I'm just guessing. And this study was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and you can see a copy of the front page of that journal here. And the conclusion was that the results of our study do not support daily bathing of critically ill patients with chlorhexidine. This is not a huge deal for hospitals, but it's something that if it's not helpful, and it's a chemical that you're putting all over patients, we shouldn't be doing it. And it also costs about $1 million a year for Vanderbilt to buy chlorhexidine. So it's a waste of money if it's not doing any good for the patients. So we consider this one of our early successes with this program. Another question that was coming up in the course of managing critically ill patients was how to optimally intubate them when they need to be put on a mechanical ventilator for surgery or for emergency conditions. And there are new tools coming out every day that are purported to help us in our work. And one of them is videolaryngoscopy. So under decades of work where I've been in the intensive care unit, if we need to put an endotracheal tube in a patient, there's a standard scope. You can put it in your pocket. It's a piece of hardware. It has a light on it, and you can see the back of the throat, put in an endotracheal tube. This new videolaryngoscopy system is a fiber optic system that allows you to control a flexible tube in the back of the throat to find the larynx, looking at the image on a screen, and it's really quite technologically fancy, but the question is it any better than what we had been doing all these years? So we conducted a study to look at that. This was a study designed by a pulmonary and critical care fellow. In fact, the chlorhexidine project was as well. Open label parallel group randomized trial, video scope versus direct laryngoscopy. Inclusion, really essentially anybody who's being intubated in the intensive care unit by one of the fellows. And the exclusion was awake intubations, too emergent to open the study envelope. The study envelope was the randomization. You had to tear the envelope open and say videoscope or direct laryngoscopy. And the last was specific laryngoscope required. Occasionally there are deformities of the neck that might require something special. So the first question is, could you see the larynx better with the videoscope than with the standard direct laryngoscope? And here you can see grade 1 is a really good view, and it's more commonly seen with the videolaryngoscope. So here, the dark bars are the videoscope, and 80% of the time you got a really good view. 50% of the time with direct laryngoscope, you got a really good view. And then the reverse was true out here. So you could see better. You could see the larynx better with the videoscope. But how successful were you on the first attempt to get the endotracheal tube in? This is the real, there are two real measures, and this is one of the most important measures of success at a good procedure. And here you can see that there was no difference between direct and video in success at the first attempt. And then the other question is, how long did that take? Did it speed it up to use a videoscope? And again, no difference in how long it took to get the tube in on that first attempt. So the results of this study are that the direct laryngoscope, as we've been doing for decades, is as good as the videoscope. Not a trivial matter. Videoscopes cost about 10 times more than a direct laryngoscope, and they're fragile. They can break. They require a lot more maintenance, a lot more space, so that every place where we would normally have one of these little devices that you can hold in your hand, we'd have to have a big setup of a video laryngoscope, and that would be okay if it was better, but it doesn't look like it's better. So this project was published in Critical Care Medicine in 2016. Another question that we've gotten into is discharges and frequent readmissions after discharge. It may or may not be surprising to you that somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of patients discharged from a hospital, or our hospital and major hospitals like ours, come back into the hospital within 30 days. 15% readmitted within 30 days, not planned readmissions. Sometimes there are surgical procedures with a planned readmission for follow-up. We're not talking about that. We sent the patient home imagining they would stay home, but they didn't 15% of the time. So this is a big deal, and Medicare services has noticed this and says this is really terrible. We shouldn't have such a high readmission rate, and we should do something about it. And in order to encourage doing something about it, we are going to fine you if you have a readmission rate that's too high. So major hospitals around the country have established programs to try to reduce readmission rates. The problem is we don't have good hard data to say that there's anything in particular we could be doing different to reduce readmission rates. So we wanted to study a post-discharge phone call system. The plan's pretty straightforward. You'd call a patient 3 days after discharge, have a script where you go over all of the activities that patient should be engaged in, their medications, their physical activity, their diet, whatever, and question them as to whether they're having any problem sticking to those programs that were prescribed. Did they have trouble getting their medicines? All the kinds of things you might imagine. And then if they had problems, you'd help them with those problems. Sounds really good. I think we'd all probably want that phone call if we'd just been discharged from a hospital. The deal is, though, it costs about $2 to $4 million a year to provide that additional service at Vanderbilt Hospital. And if it doesn't really improve the readmission rate, we shouldn't be doing it. So this is the phone call program that we were studying. This is, I'm not going to go into this as much detail excuse me, as on these slides, but we had to identify the patients and then have them randomized and shown to this nurse, who was the phone call nurse for a given service, the general medicine discharge service. And she would call everybody that showed up on her dashboard, and those names that showed up on her dashboard were shown there in a randomized way. So we have a group of patients not being called and a group of patients being called, and they're randomized. And this is the team that was extracting the data from the clinical record as to when patients were readmitted and why and so forth. And this is the team that was looking at covariates, other other things that could cause readmissions and so adjust the data for that problem. And then there was the database information itself. So there's a REDCap database we use, which is a standard for clinical research at our institution. And we put all of the data into that database. And then there was an interim analysis, which involved the safety officer, a physician, Tina Hartert, and then involved operations. And we have here Mitch Edgeworth, the CEO of the hospital, Jerry Hickson, who's in charge of quality assurance, and Robin Steben, who's head of nursing. And this was on purpose. We wanted these folks who are in operations to see how these kinds of things roll out. As I talked to Mitch Edgeworth one day about all of this, he said, in business school, I was taught, he's a businessman, in business school, I was taught that if you wanted to, you would evaluate yourself and your employees on how fast they implement something. So the question was, okay, we're going to do X, how fast did we get it done? And he said, never in that rubric was, is it worth doing? And so he said, this is the first time in my career where I've actually sat back and said, is this new thing that no matter how good it sounds, is it worth doing? And so we wanted to engage them in the process so they would feel closer to what this is all about and hopefully embrace the results when it's all over. They're all statisticians and several others involved in the review and interpretation of the study. And then there's dissemination. So this study is finished. It's under evaluation now. The results are being evaluated. And when done, we'll promulgate the results out to Vanderbilt Medical Center leadership, the Adult Enterprise Quality Committee that oversees this process, and then present it to groups like this and publish it. And then the last one I want to tell you about is one that is the most exciting, and it's late-breaking news. There are two fluids that are used in every patient admitted to every hospital in the United States, probably in the world, that goes into your IV when you're admitted to a hospital. One is lactated ringers, and the other is normal saline. There's some variations on the lactated ringer side, but for simplicity, I'll just say lactated ringers and saline. And it turns out that about 30% of the time you will get lactated ringers if you get in the hospital, and 70% of the time you'll get normal saline as your fluid. And sometimes you just get a little bit, enough to administer antibiotics and the like, and sometimes you get liters and liters and liters of it because you're in shock and the fluids are needed to support your blood pressure. There has never been a good study that says that whether there's any difference between these two. I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but these fluids are constituted differently. They have different ions, much more chloride in the sodium chloride one. There's potassium in the ringer's lactate room. So they're not identical at all. So we conducted a pilot study to see if we could randomize the administration of these two fluids. And this slide shows the study name, and the challenge was to enroll greater than 5,000 patients, controlled delivery of a time-sensitive intervention, and meaning that pretty much when you order fluids, you expect those fluids to be administered promptly, within minutes to a very short period of time, and then collect patient-level data. So the traditional approach, and this is kind of the summary of why this approach to doing research is so critical for us to consider. The traditional approach to studying more than 5,000 patients would take at least 5 years, probably longer, hundreds of personnel, dozens of centers around the country, maybe more than dozens, and millions of dollars. I'm not exaggerating. It might take $40 million to do this study well across the country. In this alternative approach with this novel study design, and I've described it already, it's the cluster randomization of our 5 intensive care units at Vanderbilt. We can do this in a much more fastidious fashion. So the delivery of the intervention is simply that if you write an order, if a physician is writing an order for fluids, and the month that the ICU is randomized to lactated ringers, if they're writing for lactated ringers, nothing happens. The order goes through just as usual. If it's the month that they're randomized to saline, the order is stopped and a screen like this comes up and says, this month we're using saline in the ICU. We suggest you use saline. Physician can go around that order, and they did in this study about 10% of the time for various reasons, but 90% of the time they went with whatever the recommendation was because they don't really care. They don't know that there's any difference between these two fluids. And so this was the pilot study was done in the medical intensive care unit just to show feasibility. And we enrolled about 900 patients in this particular feasibility study, and it worked well. And we had an endpoint which was MAKE 30, which was a combination endpoint of doubling of creatinine at a hospital discharge, new need for renal dialysis, or mortality. So a serious endpoint. And we were able to measure this endpoint in all the patients. There was no difference in this 900 patient study. We weren't surprised at that. We figured if these two fluids were that different from each other, we would have probably figured this out a long time ago. So if there is any difference between these fluids, it's a tiny difference. So we did this same sort of study structure. It's shown differently on this slide than I showed you before, but the idea is we have the ICUs here, MICU, neuro, cardiovascular, trauma, and SICU, surgical, and months across the top, and when you'll be on which fluid is all driven by this rubric here. So the results have been submitted for publication. They've been presented at national meeting, at one national meeting, the CHEST meeting in Toronto last week. And this shows that, let me start here on this slide. This was the SMART trial done in critically ill ICU adults. There's a statistically significant difference in favor of lactated ringers. In this slide, it's called balanced solution. And every one of these criteria, every one of these components, the doubling of creatinine, the new need for dialysis or mortality, were increased when you got saline versus when you got balanced fluids. So this is an effect that it's small, but it's real. And the other study that I'm pointing out here is one that was done on non-ICU patients at the same time, finding the same result. So this is almost 25,000 patients randomized to these two fluids and showing this result is reproducible. And again, it's small, but if you just do a back of the envelope calculation, the 0.7% difference in mortality that's coming out of these two studies, multiplied across the 35 million people admitted to hospitals in the United States every year, you get something in the neighborhood of 300,000 lives a year saved by using the right fluid. And we didn't know it until now. So this is really shakes us up. We're converting Vanderbilt Hospital over to exclusively use of balanced fluids, which is predominantly lactated ringers, as we speak. So coming back, this is the platform we're building to do these kinds of studies. We want to make sure that we provide services and support for folks that have an interest in asking these important clinical questions and keep it going. And this is just a listing of studies underway presently. The one at the top is the one I just talked to you about, and there are many more. I don't have time to go through them now. And then there's some that are just not practical. Those are the red. We look at them and we say, this is not going to be able to be done for one reason or another, and so we just move on to the next project. So I'll stop there, and I thank you very much for your attention.